So my name is Sarah McKinnon, and I'm the Faculty Director of Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation for this morning, No Future Without Us, Indigenous Knowledges and Climate Justice, Conocimientos Climáticos y Justicia del Clima. LATIS has been present on campus since the 1930s. I always like to contextualize that. We've had a long presence on campus. And we're considered one of the major US centers for research regarding Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Iberian Peninsula. We work across all of those regions. We have faculty affiliated. We do lots of presentations like this. We host amazing speakers like Diego that you'll hear from in a moment. And so we're always excited to have community here to join us in learning together. For this presentation today, we're also joined as co-sponsors by American Indian and Indigenous Studies, the Department of Anthropology, and the Human Rights Program. So I want to thank them also for participating in these events. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to take a moment to recognize that the land we are on today is the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk Nation, who have called this land Dejope since time immemorial. I want to acknowledge the circumstances that led to their forced removal and also honor their history of resistance and resilience. The Ho-Chunk Nation and the other 11 First Nations residing within Wisconsin remain vibrant and strong. And LASIS recognizes this sovereignty of the 12 First Nations that reside within Wisconsin. This history of colonization continues to inform our work, and in LASIS we see it as connected to the dynamics of colonization that the peoples of the Americas in total have experienced. And so we always want to make sure that we're considering that and considering our shared future. And so with that, I want to welcome our speaker for today, Diego Tituaña, who is Quechua Otavalo. Diego is a diplomat from Ecuador and a member-elect of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2026 to 2028. So he's about to begin the session, I believe. Since joining the Ecuadorian Foreign Service in 2012, Diego has worked extensively to advance Indigenous peoples' rights and participation in multilateral spaces. He coordinated the UN General Assembly resolution on the rights of Indigenous peoples. This was a decade, which led to the proclamation of the year 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Diego also has multilateral experience in human rights, disarmament, and migration issues. For example, in his role as the head of the technical office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the province of Imbabura, he oversaw human mobility and foreign policy issues in Ecuador's northern border region, the border region with Colombia. So we're thrilled to hear his perspectives on another important issue of our time, climate justice, and how Indigenous perspectives and cosmovisions are key to our future on this warming climate. So please join me in welcoming Diego Tituaña.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you, Lassie, for hosting me here in university. Well, I have some bad news and good news for me, because yesterday we were talking with Lassie about how it's going to be develop my presentation, and they recommend me to do it in Spanish, so I hope that most of you can understand. That's why I said bad, good for some of you probably, but good news for me. But well, we can do, if something is not clear, I can do all my effort to explain in English. However, what I did is try to mix. I'm going to show the slides in English, and I will speak in Spanish but don't hesitate. I don't like to have this presentation like as a, I don't know, panel without interaction.
Yeah.
So if we can have some questions, please let me know in English or in Spanish, and it's okay. So I will do my best. But of course, for me, it's going to be uh, easy to develop my presentation in Spanish. So now I will turn to Spanish. Bueno, buenos días con todos y gracias por tomarse el tiempo en venir acá. Gracias a Sara y gracias a Lassie por tenerme acá. Entonces, bueno, vamos a hablar hoy un poco sobre lo que corresponde a conocimientos de los pueblos indígenas y justicia ambiental. En realidad, yo no soy un experto en temas ambientales. Quizás si venían con esa perspectiva, pues no voy a hablarles específicamente de los conceptos ni de los conocimientos ambientales que son promovidos o que son parte de la sabiduría de los pueblos indígenas. Lo que sí, voy a yo a conversarles un poco de cómo se está generando, se ha desarrollado una participación importante de los pueblos indígenas dentro de las discusiones, las negociaciones sobre cambio climático. Entonces, bueno, para esto es fundamental que retrocedamos a 1992, que es la cumbre de la Tierra. Voy a ir pasando los slides para que nos acomodemos en el espacio, pero quería tener como un espacio fundamental en este momento. La cumbre de la Tierra es una de las más importantes y es en las que se adoptan 3 convenciones fundamentales para abordar temas ambientales. Se adopta la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas sobre Cambio Climático. Se adopta la Convención sobre la Diversidad Biológica y se adopta la Convención de Naciones Unidas de Lucha contra la Desertificación. Estas tres convenciones son muy importantes, están interconectadas con el abordaje del cambio climático, del medio ambiente. Entonces, tengamos muy en cuenta 1992. Yo no voy a desarrollar lo que corresponde a la Convención de Diversidad Biológica y tampoco de lucha contra la desertificación, por un poco enfocarnos en el tema al que me han invitado a desarrollar. Entonces, como les decía, en este año se adopta la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas sobre Cambio Climático, que es el principal tratado para coordinar las respuestas internacionales. No sé cuántos de ustedes están familiarizados con la adopción de resoluciones, la negociación de convenciones. Quiero hacer una pausa aquí porque es importante entender esta dinámica para luego ver cómo se involucra o cómo se desarrolla la participación de los pueblos. ¿Alguien sabe cómo se adopta una convención, tal vez? ¿Alguien está relacionado con el sistema de Naciones Unidas de alguna forma?
Are folks familiar with this?
¿No? ¿No?
Can I ask a question? Folks who are bilingual, Spanish, English, can you just, because we can also do assistance
And I
translating.
can do in English if you want.
Savannah and I can help too, so.
Yeah.
So how many of you, please raise your hand, the ones that can understand both. That's not the majority.
I thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, no, if you want to, I can do it in English too, like, for example, just to repeat a little bit, but does anyone is like involved with the UN system or how the convention are adopted? Most of you? Okay, well, let's start with something that what is the UN? No, does anybody know what is the UN? So normally the people believe that the UN is the building, like in Manhattan. I used to think the same, that we believe this big building at the river of New York, but that is the infrastructure. But how it is composed, the UN? The UN is an intergovernmental body, which means that the governments are the ones that compose the UN. And how many of them? 193 countries, 193 member states. So why is important this aspect? Because most of the time, we were talking a little bit with Sarah a few moments ago, and I said, you must go, you must attend the next conference of state party of the climate change convention. So this is important to understand because the decisions are taken by the member states. And who are the representatives of the member states? The representatives are the diplomats.
Mm.
So that's why I say that it's not just the building that we normally see. Around the block of the UN, there is, I mean, the correct term is permanent missions, but not most of the people are accustomed to this term, so we call embassies.
Mm.
But we have different convention around diplomatic. That is another conference. But then, so around the block of the UN, you are going to have many offices. Yeah. Some countries will have suites inside buildings, other countries has buildings, big buildings.
Mm.
And in those buildings or in those apartments are working the diplomats. You know. So they are who are negotiating different resolutions, and they are the ones that negotiate conventions because the way how does this work works at the intergovernmental bodies. So it's really important to understand that because probably you are a really high profile expert in climate change. But if you don't have the credentials to attend the meeting as representative of the government, you cannot have the opportunity to, I mean, you can participate, but you are not in the space to take decision, to raise your voice and fight for something to be added or to be taken out from the document. So it's really important to understand that because we have really high expert in on the academic part, but also from the indigenous people side. But the main difficulty for the indigenous peoples, and not just for the indigenous people, but in general, when, for example, we are talking about a conference on women, and not all women can, and also in the past, there was not so many women negotiating their convention, their resolution. So it's really important to understand that. Because, well, just a definition, just to put together on the same line about what is climate change, just to be sure. This is the definition that is adopted in the convention. Is in the one of the main part of the conventions about definition. Also, these definitions are negotiated. So, but of course, we need really good expert for that. But the one who's sitting and representing the member state is the one that allow to maintain certain language, expand, eliminate, as I mentioned. But this is what climate change means under the convention. And as I mentioned, the convention is the principal treaty of the coordination international response to climate change. So is the change of climate, which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. That alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable time. So if you want to know, if you want to check, you can check the convention, and then you will see this is the definition. But there are many other aspects that you can include, consider, but this is what it is under the convention. And why I mentioned that? Because also in the Earth Summit, Cumbre de la Tierra, another important declaration was adopted. It's the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, in which in the principle 22, it says as follows: indigenous people and their communities and other local communities have a vital role in environmental management and development because of their knowledge and traditional practice. States should recognize and duly support their identity, culture, and interests, and enable their effective participation in the achievement of sustainable development. I want to highlight something here because this was in 1992. I don't know how many of you are familiar with indigenous people struggles at the UN. So just to let you know that in the same time, there also there was a negotiation working groups were drafting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because here you said it says indigenous people, and this was a concept that was developed somehow in this time because previously we were not known as that. I say we were not because I am indigenous. I have the capacity to say that, but it was tribal relations, many others concepts. Just want to let you know that, I'm going to elaborate a little bit that, but in that moment, in parallel, there was a movement, international movement, working and drafting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted in 2007. But here we start having a little bit of the influence of indigenous peoples that were part of the negotiation. No were part as a state party, but they were around the negotiations, around the discussion conversations that were took place in those moments. So here exactly in the first summit, it has the opportunity that indigenous people also raise their voice. And they say, as I mentioned, we don't have a podium. Marcos Terena, who was the person who delivered the declaration and have the opportunity to tell says, we don't have a podium, but we met in an indigenous. And he said something really important, interesting, really important. So in the conference, that you don't have to do your own research. We want to offer our science and wisdom for free. Are you ready? Be ready for this. So that is something that called attention. And as I mentioned, in that moment also there was the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was also drafting. In one of the struggle of indigenous people, not only in this space, and it was to have opportunity to think. They want to establish a new global order and to have an indigenous. And I'm going to skip in this part because what is coming is related with what I mentioned before of indigenous people and indigenous peoples. And normally in this moment, the people were talking about traditional knowledge, and somehow it's something that it was a concept that was used in many of the discussion about indigenous people rights. But it's really interesting how we change that, because now we and have to differentiate about indigenous knowledge versus traditional knowledge. And I have some comparison. Like, you know, when we refer to indigenous knowledge, is a knowledge system developed by indigenous people over generation. When you refer to traditional knowledge, it's local knowledge from non-indigenous community. Could be indigenous, but could be not indigenous too. So, you know, this is one of the main discussions between both concepts. So, and this is really important in the climate change discussion, because later on, when they were negotiating the Paris Agreement, the indigenous knowledge was recognized specifically, because we were having this kind of discussion. And also another thing that we are still having discussions with local communities together with the indigenous knowledge. So it's really important to understand this part because also indigenous knowledge implies the recognition of collective rights, which is the main difference on what I mentioned before, that we have, remember, indigenous people. When you refer indigenous people, you are not recognized. And that was one of the main achievements that the Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People has, is because adding the S at the end of indigenous people, you are recognizing the collective right of indigenous people, which is essential also in this conversation of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. So it also implies the recognition of collective rights, self-determination, but also the political implication of the recognition of the free, prior, and informed consents. In some countries consent, in other countries consult. And as I mentioned, this was explicitly recognized in the Article 7.5 for climate change adaptation. So if you go back before of Paris Agreement, it wasn't recognized in the formal document. But after Paris Agreement, we refers, at least when we're talking about climate change negotiations, about indigenous knowledge, not traditional knowledge, with all these now which implies more the worldview of indigenous people, the practice developed by indigenous people from millenniums, and the many ways that we afford or we maintain the harmony with the nature. But here is really important also that the indigenous knowledge ensure the effective participation of indigenous people in climate change governance, and that the strength the climate justice. So as I mentioned, when we have negotiation of the Paris Agreement with the recognition of indigenous knowledge, which ensure effective participation of indigenous people, also is a good call in the way that they need to develop another ways to include the indigenous people participation under the negotiation on the rights on the climate change discussions. And with that, I'm going to jump to the how is the way that indigenous peoples participate on climate change negotiation. One of the, and we have two ways. One is under the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change, which is the political caucus that coordinates positions and advance rights across multiple negotiations, with Article 6, loss and damage. And the other one is through the working group with local communities and indigenous people. The second one was developed after the agreement, after the Paris Agreement. So going back to the International Indigenous People Forum Climate Change, formally it was established in 2008. But do you remember that I mentioned that Marcos Terena spoke of the opportunity to make a statement in 1992, but the mechanism that was formally in 2000. It was good that in those times they have some ways to participate, not to negotiate, but at least to raise their voice internally in the discussions or in parallel. But the indigenous peoples international movement, which is somehow intervening and participating in different international forums, also was part of the discussion on climate change. So from our understanding, indigenous people are involved in the discussions since 1990s, but through these coalitions, more supported by NGOs. But it was good that later on in 2008 was recognized officially as a part of the other non-actors, member state non-actors that are being involved in participating in the discussion. So the International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change represents indigenous voices at COP and technical sessions, advocates for collective rights and free, prior, and informed consent, and promote inclusion of traditional knowledge. So this is one of the spaces, the traditional space of which indigenous people normally used to gather together and trying to push for include their vision, their wisdom into the solutions that they are trying to find on climate change discussion. But also, as I mentioned, after the Paris Agreement, because of this developing of the new concept of indigenous knowledge, they were pushed because also that ensure, as I mentioned, effective participation of indigenous people. They were creating another platform for the participation, which is the local community and indigenous people platform. That was created in 2015. I mentioned under the UNFCCCC, and strengthen the role of indigenous people and local community in climate action. They focus on knowledge sharing, capacity building, policy integration, and is coordinated by a facility working group, which is composed by 7 members nominated by member state and 7 members nominated by the indigenous organization. But I just want to highlight something, and that's why I recommend Sarah to attend these meetings, because I see like how the indigenous people are using or are not using properly these spaces. So when I had the opportunity to attend one of these meetings, I see, for example, that more and more, and it's really good to see that indigenous people are attending this. And these are big conferences that are hosted by one member state. So each year, because the convention have the conference of state parties that meet and continue developing the agreements that have been made recently with the Paris Agreement. And so they need to develop those compromises. So they meet each year around November in different countries.
Mhm.
And more, we are having more indigenous people participation. But, for example, in the we can consider the one of the spaces of the caucus of indigenous people that yes, I mean this is indigenous people speaking for ourselves, and they meet each day before the official meeting start at 10. This is like a normal schedule at the UN system. Like they start 10 to 1 and 3 to 6. That is how we usually work. That is our schedule at the UN level, at the UN system. So they meet before. But unfortunately, when they are trying to get some coordination, they are just a few which are really like engaged with the discussion. They are more than 100 indigenous people attending the conference, but you will see in the caucus coordination meetings, then 20 months.
Mm.
But they are still maintaining a strong this space because we are going to find two different ways to move under these two separate mechanisms participation. So one is as I mentioned, it's more political. The International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change. They coordinate positions. They attend the meetings. But what I said at the beginning, do you remember what I said about how does the UN works? Who are the ones that are negotiating? And the representative of a member state. So there is not yet a possibility that is not going to change. I can say because that is how does work the UN system as a intergovernmental body. In the way that indigenous people cannot raise their voice and say we want to have this and this by themselves and negotiate directly with member state. So the political coordination they do internally, and they need to find member states, member representatives, state representatives that can support their idea. That is the way that is working. So that is how the Indigenous People Forum Climate Change works. Now they also have a pavilion. It's really good. But when they coordinate, they are some meetings that also they cannot attend because they are different credentials to allow different individuals to enter to some the meetings. But in the other side, we have the facility working group within the local community and indigenous peoples participation. That is more structured in the way that is coming and this mechanism belongs to the UNFCCC. It's part of that. They have the secretariat, but they also cannot, they have the opportunity to attend us too, but it's not also as a mechanism that allow them to negotiate. But they have more formal participation. The campus is informal. Campus is informal. The campus allow them to meet coordinating position, but they need to find friendly member states that can support their idea. And in the other side of, even though it's more formal, but they need to adopt the decision by consent. And if it's not a consent, they cannot continue with that. But the indigenous people are like fighting in both sides because one is like they can say or coordinate whatever they want. In the other one, they somehow they cannot do it because they need to pass through this bureaucracy aspect internally and then try to coordinate. But it goes because they can use like a mechanism to raise their voice. So yes, this is something that I wanted to mention in this aspect. Why we are here? Because we believe that with indigenous rights and climate change and climate justice include the recognition of territorial and cultural rights, self-determination, participation in decision making, and the mechanisms, like those mechanisms, ensure these rights and respecting climate governance. And to the end, as a conclusion, I can say that this knowledge is not cultural heritage, but also a key asset to combat climate change. That both mechanisms, even though they are developing, empower indigenous people in enrich global climate strategy. And the climate justice requires equity, recognition, and respect for diversity knowledge system. We are advancing. That is a good news. But unfortunately, I can say that what we need is to strengthen the capacity on indigenous people side. Nowadays, most of us are attending the meetings, and it's a big conference in which they are the conference is separate, right? Pavilions, no. And I see that most of the indigenous people participation focus on the sides event. That is a good step, but what is happening is that while more than 100 indigenous people are attending this international conference, and they goes to one space like this, you know, that I can say what I believe. But in the other room, they are the members still negotiating. So they are not somehow hearing each other. So at the end, I heard like many times at the end of the conference that indigenous people said, why, but this doesn't work because they are not including what we believe. But they are in the other room. Where they are not hearing. So it's really important that indigenous people can use these mechanisms to influence in the negotiation. But so far, not all of them, but the majority of them are working in the different ways. The member states are dealing, and you know, this is, for example, the international, the local community and indigenous people platform that was created by member states. After Paris Agreement, in the different COPs, and Ecuador was one of the countries that were supporting and promoting really hard the creation of this platform, supporting by the wisdom of indigenous people, consulting with indigenous people that were attending the meeting. That was possible to happen. So it's good to know that. But it's really important that indigenous people also can continue engaging with this method of work, because otherwise going to continue participating in one side, in one room, while the negotiation is in the other room. So that is something that is really important to stress. Unfortunately, talking about from Latin American region, we have two disadvantages. One is that it's really important to have resources, to ensure resources to participate. Now, these conferences are taking place in many different parts of the world. So most of the indigenous people participate the first week, while the negotiation is maintaining for the 2 weeks. And coming from the Latin American side, it's also a big challenge, the English, the language. Because while we have some meetings in where we have translations, interpretations, but in the negotiations themselves, they don't have interpretation. So that is another big challenge. And yeah, we are, or they are organizing also sites event and with interpretation, but if we continue maintaining separating their process, that is a challenge that we need to overcome. So in conclusion, there is the conference. I'm so sorry to not get into the concept of the specific example of the wisdom of indigenous people addressing climate change. I said I'm not an expert on that, but I am an expert on to try to strengthen the mechanism of participation of indigenous people in international forums. So this is something that I wanted to focus in this aspect to share with all of you, giving like the big picture of how does the UN work and how we need to strengthen the participation of indigenous people in that way. That's all. Thank you so much.
Folks, we have time for questions, so I open it up to you for questions for Diego. Oh, sorry, you were in my blind spot. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm wondering if you know of any forums that are linked with the UN negotiations on climate change that bring together scientists, Western scientists, and indigenous people, where I'm assuming that sometimes maybe they talk to scientists in these negotiations, and seems like it would be good if like those voices could be joined in advocating for indigenous.
Well, the conference of state parties is like the main space in which they get together. They are doing that. They are doing that. They are initiatives in which science are like sittings together because it's part of the dynamics of the conversation. But here is also the another part. It's like important that how can I say, tripartito, three parties that can enter to the discussion is like science from the Western side, science from the indigenous people side, but also the member states which are in the negotiation. Because this is something, as I mentioned, you can be a high expert on any matter and any subject. But if you are not in the negotiation, sometimes, and I say that a diplomat or a person that was part of negotiation, that we don't know and we can change like the correct way to address the words or the data, because you need to sit together with the negotiator too. So it's something that have to be linked by the three ways. But the conference of state parties is like the space in which they are somehow interacting each other. in Spanish.
In Spanish?
No, no.
My question is, I found really interesting your thoughts and explanations about diplomacy, who is an expert, and that illusion of false representation, like you are here, but in a separate room. So we are not hearing you, but we are giving you a voice, but we don't care like what you are saying. And I would like to know your thoughts. We have a strong debate in Colombia right now about diplomacy because the current president of our country is trying to change like the level of under requisites for diplomats. So one condition to be a diplomat is that you must speak English, and he wants to change that. But the debate is, if you don't speak English, how are you supposed to go to these different spaces when the decisions are taken in English? And you were explaining that sometimes in your case, you have translations and interpretation, but it's not always that way. So English for me remains like the main obstacle for doing this, for making the decision, because we can have a voice in those spaces, but if that voice doesn't speak English, it's very difficult. So what can we do? What would be like ideas that you have in mind to preserve the languages, to try to welcome these different populations that have something to contribute but don't speak English?
Uh, well, I can say that I am an example of what is important to include us in the different level of spaces, like diplomat corps, for example. In the way that even now you can understand a little bit, and
Pretty well.
I would like to. But that is something that came because after I entered to the diplomat corps.
Mhm.
We need to understand something that we have a structural inequality when we talk about these people. I mean, if you don't open the opportunity, we are not going to have in many years this again opportunity to enter because for us it's different. Like we most of us are grow up in the communities, grow up in the Spanish environment. So when we are going to
Mhm.
learn English as other people can have those opportunities, like you have people like have the opportunity to study abroad, you have opportunity that have the resources to send their kids to private school, which they have, but for them is like it's not a struggle to not know English, but for us it is. So I think it's good that allow them to enter, but they need to prepare at least for 2 3 years, like like find the ways to allow them in the like with high profile capacity, of course, because we have that. We have indigenous youth that are really good, but they don't speak English. So they need. I believe that in the meantime that they are allowed to enter, they need also to have a term 2 to 3 years that, for example, can develop their English like with resources like like we normally don't have. As I mentioned, like in this
That's very
aspect, I met really good indigenous people, participants in these meetings, and they don't speak English. So they're trying to find people to help them to say, in this paragraph, it would be better to put this and this. And you heard them, it's like really good proposals, but they are not in the capacity to uh, to include us because they cannot interact with other ones.
Mhm.
So yeah, if we maintain in that structure, nothing is gonna change. So it's good to try to find ways to allow the participation, to understanding the, say, the structural disadvantage that we normally face as indigenous people. And all of them, I think nowadays we are having indigenous representatives that are like part of good universities in English language and so on. Probably in the future it will be not necessary to have it, but at this time I think that if we want to have more indigenous diplomats, for example, in many part of the
Mm.
Latin American countries, we need to address actions in which the English cannot be a barrier to enter, but can be you can say like stop before you can go to the embassies until you have the opportunity to study, to gain the knowledge in the country that you can have it, but that is something different like a public policy that can be applied.
I really like that idea, and I'm sorry for the interruption, because I think that part of the debate in Colombia is that they shouldn't diplomats learn English. It's like a fight, like an ideological fight. Like we won't speak in English because you need to also learn our languages. But I really like your approach, because he's saying you are allowed to come here, like because you have a voice and something to contribute, and in the meantime you are learning the language to speak. So I think it's really useful because it's contributing to dialogue rather than stopping it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lipa, Jenny, Diego, for the presentation here. So I actually have a question more or less sort of in this ambience of the conversation. So you were kind of talking about the barriers, obviously, when it comes to indigenous representation within the negotiation tables. And really, obviously, language being a sort of dynamic there. And then also, of course, these sort of side events. And then you also have like the main sort of folks that are negotiating what you would think indigenous people are sort of proposing. And then it seems like there's a lot of like wire around how to get from point A to point B when it comes to getting a proposal through and accepted in the first place. So my question kind of comes down to that negotiation table. You already mentioned some of the barriers that prevents indigenous peoples to coming into that sort of field, but who are the indigenous people, besides obviously those that can speak English, who are the ones that are sort of invited by the reps of state to come into those fields? Are they pre-selected, or are they sort of like, okay, English come in, English come in? What is sort of like that sort of view? Because obviously, because the language could be one thing, but then I would assume also there's probably some tie-in regarding like political affiliation, or direction, or policy, sort of same-minded policies and such, or are there sort of like a diverse viewpoints within the indigenous folks? So we know that exists, but are those folks from diverse backgrounds and viewpoints also brought into that negotiation? I kind of wanted to get some clarification regarding who is essentially in that meeting specifically.
Well, first, thank you, Chris. The thing is that they are like, as I mentioned, and in the different conference, the dynamics change. Like, for example, when we are negotiating the resolution of the rights of indigenous people under the General Assembly, is not a space to allow to invite any, not just the indigenous, but any non-actors, member state actor, because the negotiation table is closed only for the representative of the member states. And then it's not like the opportunity to say, okay, I can invite, even if they like are somehow aligned politically, it's not that way. In the Conference of State Party, so also we have like different space, as mentioned. They are pavilion for like non-state actors, they are pavilion for which they are more focused on science, but in separate they are the negotiation. and they are open meeting and closed meetings. You know? And you for to attend the meeting, the conference, you need one way to enter.
Mhm.
You know, there are some countries, like for example, Ecuador, allow the participation of different actors, not just indigenous, but anyone that would like to attend. They can have like, it is a badge called the overflow that allow anyone that can, and this is a practice that is used by other member states. I know this as a fact from Ecuador that they open the call for the ones that want to register. Of course, they need to be Ecuadorians, and unnecessary, as I said, indigenous, but anyone that would like to attend, and they are giving this overflow pass. With this overflow plus, they can first enter to the big conference, and they can work for any of the pavilions. That includes the negotiations. So, but they attend as observer. As observer, you need to understand how is the dynamic of the negotiation and address. Like, because, for example, you know, this is something that it's happened, you know, 100 at the UN level, it's 193 countries. We need to see who are the ones that registered that participant of the under the Confederate State Party. Sometimes are less, sometimes are more, but you are going to see a different view even from members. So the best way to address something is that even though you are from Ecuador or I don't know, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, but if you are seeing that, for example, Canada is like supportive for, as I mentioned, after the Paris Agreement, Canada, Ecuador, and other countries, Latin America, were pushing for the creation of the platform. So even though you are like, I don't know, from Paraguay and your country is not supporting, but you see that these other member states are supporting that, you need to address them. So it's in the other side. It's not that you are invited. Here, I think it's more how you are curious and how you are able to be involved in the negotiations. So it's not like we are invited. No, no one is invited. But the negotiation is our own member state, always, and the representative. Sometimes depend of the, and not just in the dimension negotiation, but in the different negotiations, you will see that you can invite some of them for the expertise to give a talk, to deliver a statement, but finally that will be adopted, negotiated and adopted by member states. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. Maybe just a quick follow-up with that, because, you know, you mentioned like, for example, Ecuador is a member state and, you know, they've sort of been one of these primary folks to be able to bring in representation of indigenous voices within these types of spaces and have that essentially have that space. And then, you know, you come to the resolution that's negotiated and I'm assuming probably enacted and finalized. But then, what happens then with that sort of final resolution? How is that then assured that across these member states that have agreed this resolution, that it's applied? Because you know, for one thing, you know, you can talk about agreed resolution when it comes to supporting indigenous peoples, indigenous knowledge or climate justice and other, you know, factors as well. But then when you go to those specific member groups or member countries within territory and see that those, you know, actions are not being applied, how enforced are those, you know, resolutions really? Are they just sort of like guidance in the sense of like what folks, you know, they propose that states should do? Or is there some sense of accountability that's happened maybe, you know, the following year, for instance, saying like, hey, like, you know, we agreed upon this last year, but we saw that within your country, these things have not been really follow through? What's up with that sort of thing, you know? Yeah, I kind of want to know perhaps the accountability piece, like how strong of that is that? Is it just kind of like you negotiate it, it's good, and then it is what it is, sort of whatever happens in that country that agreed or didn't agree?
This is like not just only in climate change, but in general. At the end, like we need to think like in a good faith, you know. Unfortunately, or probably in a good way, we don't have like a international police, no. This is how is a debate, and I'm not just saying about like climate change, no, it's in general. More and more like you know that you are like the the idea of the objective of to put together all the member states is that you are acting in a good faith, you know, like you are compromising with any, and the UN resolutions, for example, from the General Assembly are not binding. That is one of the principles of the UN General Assembly resolution. That is how that works. But there are many resolutions in which it will depend of the member state to specifically take actions or accomplish with the compromise that they did that resolution. Or in the conventions, of course, same. The convention is a little bit more like have an obligation because you are a state party. Yeah, you say that you are agreed to do that. But the question that you raised is like one of the biggest questions on how that the UN system documents, I mean, agreements are treated by the ones that are empowering each different state. So it's more deep.
Right here and then right here.
Hi, thank you so much for your insight today. It was really interesting to think about how we can solve these problems through the structure that we have, which is the UN, which is very limited. I was really interested in how you coordinated between indigenous peoples. Is it just in terms of representation in the forums? So is it mostly indigenous groups that are organized by states in Latin America? Or I imagine that there are more indigenous groups globally. And so what does it look like to maybe coordinate knowledge from Southeast Asia versus Latin America? And if there are forms of knowledge or forms of like goals that are that create strong coalitions in the forum, or goals that are more difficult to come to agreements with in the forum.
Yeah, well, another difficult question, but that is how that works. You know, well, as I mentioned, in the meantime that we were having this negotiation on the environment and climate change in 1992 was also parallel was drafting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is a result of the struggles that indigenous people has trying to raise their voice into the UN system many years ago, but starting formally somehow in the 70s with the Martinez-Cobo report. But then you now start with a difficult question of the representation, because and I said it because it could, for example, at this moment we have a different mechanism of participation for indigenous people. At the UN system, for example, we have the Permanent Forum, which they meet together in New York around April for 2 weeks. We have the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people at the Human Rights Council level. they meet in July in Geneva. There are another special procedure under the Human Rights Council, which is the special rapporteur on the rights. That is a little bit separate with the other two, because in those other two that I mentioned before, the expert mechanism, development forum, for example, you have the opportunity, or they have the opportunity to attend the meeting. And you will see that they are like a different view, as you mentioned, for example, it's totally different, and that's why there is not a definition of who is indigenous people. If you see the Martinez report, Martinez Cover report, you see you have an understanding of what can include to be indigenous, but there is not a definition per se that says this, because have a different views in that way too. It's, as you mentioned, it's kind of easy to define who is indigenous in the American continent besides who is indigenous in Asia or in Africa. You will see, for example, in the permanent forum session, in that I'm not going to a diplomat, I cannot say this country or that country, but there is one representative from one country says, we don't have indigenous people in our country. And other says, we all of us are indigenous.
Oh.
So here enter this controversial understanding. Well, that cannot, it's good to know that that is not considered an obstacle to advance. As I mentioned, since 70s, we had a huge advance on the mechanism of participation, the inclusion. For example, if you see the UNFCCC convention, there is no any mention about indigenous people, but in the Paris Agreement you have mentioned. If you see the Millennium Development Goal, there is no reference for indigenous people. But if you see the ODS, the Sustainable Development Goals, you have mentioned. So far, even though there is this kind of not general understanding or agreement of who are or who are indigenous as in the world, that allow us to advance. But then you enter to a difficult, another difficult part, like who are attending those meetings. So that's why we call them like the international movement of indigenous people, because of course they are people that with really good experience. Like Marco is still attending meetings, and other folks from around that time of the previous, they are attending sessions and continue fighting for it. But you don't know, for example, as you mentioned, sometimes I do remember one of the resolutions that we were like negotiating. And I said, I mean, like, of course we have that privilege somehow, like, to be in those spaces, but there are people in our own continent that they don't know and they don't care about those spaces because they are surviving, in the community. So the important thing in that aspect is to that the ones that are attending the meetings can understand or can come from these spaces that allow them to somehow explain the reality coming from the field. That would be like a good steps to continue advance. It's something that is happening, but it's not like everyone is like coming from the community, or everyone is the representative interaction. They are different mechanisms which are strengthening that way.
Does it matter like what jobs people do to the degree that they want to get involved? Like when I think about sustainability or things like the environment, I think farming. And so I think like people in South America, and is it sometimes to if you're talking about traditional ways, is it sometimes a little bit over romanticized what traditional ways are? Because I mean, I'm thinking about, let's say in the United States, if you talk about farming, a lot of people like to see stuff like the small farm, and they like to say, let's go back to the way it was, but I don't think that people understand how difficult or how the sacrifices you make by having things, you know what I'm saying? That you can't find people that will do they have the traditional family farm anymore, so because of this, you have big farms now. And I'm thinking that is the same, is it at all the same with indigenous people to say, we've become mechanized in certain ways, and, you know what I'm saying, like, how many people live by traditional ways anymore? And has it become more of a global thing to say, like almost an individual thing where people are saying, I'm trying to live simply? And then if you say that, then you say, even if it's devoid of traditional ways, shouldn't we just have a voice because we're underrepresented? You know what I'm saying? Like, even if, let's say I'm a person that doesn't do things traditionally, but I'm of your group, maybe I should have a voice just because my people don't have a voice. So there's like discussion within there, you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
within your own group.
Do you have thoughts about that?
No, I mean, that is something that is happening. Like, you cannot be against of develop your ways of living, but they also, I have to respect that there are people that really would like to maintain those methods of living. You know, with the time, I don't know, but at least in my kids, more and more I want to be more in peace than living in like big cities, you know, like of course they are advantage, but the otherwise you have another way. So that is this discussion are part of that. But of course, at the indigenous people side, there are also like diversity views of that, as you mentioned, and everyone have deserve the same right. You know, like it's not like I am the represented. I have to have a voice because I am underrepresented, and I'm just going to continue promoting certain way. I mean, everything is changing. At least in our side is the same, but I believe that is the important aspect here is that when they enter to this discussion internally, how they can develop with a solution, you know, maintaining this, how can I say, uh, uh, positive approach, you know, to continue maintaining our lives. You have diversity for sure, but they discuss, we discuss by ourselves, and then we see what we can promote or not.
I have a few questions, if that's okay. So I have two questions. So the first is that the next co-op is in November in Brazil, right? I'm curious if it matters that it's in Brazil with such a rich dynamic of indigenous communities, indigenous peoples that are there, are like really pressing on environmental issues. So that was one question that came to mind as I think about Brazil. And then the other one, I was struck with the 1992 Earth Summit Declaration, that in it, there's language for indigenous peoples being managers of the land. I think that framing is really striking and important. And so I guess I want to hear more about that. What does that look like? Why is that important? What's important about the situatedness and the recognition as managers of the land?
Well, the first thing, of course, is an expectation, as you mentioned, like what will be the overcome in Brazil because of the let's say the strong indigenous population, and how right now is the political support
Yeah.
at country. But we don't have to forget that at the end, the result of the negotiation is going to be between all the member state parties. So sometimes even though you are like this place like could be you can have some pressure, you know, but some pressure for some government.
Right.
But there are other governments that it doesn't matter where they are. They are looking or want to include or want to eliminate or want to advance or want to prioritize in one specific issue. No, so that doesn't mean that if we go to this country, we are going to have more strong Indian. It's like it's also controversial in that way because at least also when you are like facilitating, you are like in another position to impose. You know, like you when you are the host, you are like trying to maintain the balance. You want to push for something, but you need to maintain the balance. At the end, the successful of the conference is that all of them are agree with something. So it's an expectation. It's a possibility that the other member state can say, okay, we are going to include this and this because we are here. But not a guarantee, because it's the discussion and the result of what all the member states participants are agree in something or disagree. And the other part is like, yes, I mean, like, as you mentioned, in 1992, they started with that. I think they are advancing in something like that because including indigenous knowledge is a good advance in that way because now in that moment was part of the declaration, yeah, but not part of the agreement as well as the convention, no. But in the Paris Agreement now you have that recognition, formally recognition, which ensures, as I mentioned, like collective rights, which ensures like participation, which includes governance. So they are, and it's something that I want to highlight in this aspect. In the multilateral level, you go step by step, and sometimes they are small steps. Yeah, it's not how we would like to have the work advance, but it's how the multilateral negotiation. You know, for example, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People took more than 30 years to be adopted. So, and sometimes for some of us, we be like, why? This agreement is sometimes this an international environment, difficulties, wars, you know, like things like that. But it's advancing a little bit, at least. Now I think depend on us, as from indigenous people sides, like to be more proactive, to prepare, to be in the capacity to get more into the negotiations, understanding the difficulties, understanding the advantage that we can have, and approaching the ones that are like somehow supporting our project. Now it's not like in the past, like but really close the doors. They are windows there, so it's important to approach in that way.
Okay. Folks, we have time for probably one more question.
Yeah, thank you, Diego, for the important and insightful discussion. And I'm just curious, as you're moving into this term in 2026, what, if you have any particular goals or voices or approaches that you're focused on and hoping to bring into this term?
Yes, I mean, I would like, I don't know if I'm going to have a time because it's only 3 years and many, you know, I wish personally, I would like to focus on climate change, on artificial intelligence and indigenous migration. This is something that I would like to do. I don't know I'm going to have the opportunity to develop that, but I would like to because at the end, we are 16 members and we don't know how we are going to have an agreement to advance because this is because I somehow I was involved in these 3 matters personally, but I don't know what my colleagues will bring to the table,
Mm.
and I hope we can at least have an agreement to advance in one of the issues. But personally, if I can, I would like to work on those 3 aspects. And crossing fingers that I can have. But, you know, in the past, I used to give a talk to the new members of the Vernon Forum. I was invited to explain them about the UN General Assembly and the rights of the people. And I always say, recommend to them, try to establish a work plan for with objectives in 3 years. And it was difficult. I was listening there because everyone has their same priorities, and imagine 16 members like, and well, let's see. And I think that we need to advance it that way because we have many recommendations under the report of the Development Fund. And if we don't focus and establish like a roadmap, at least with 1 or 2 teams, they are going to continue being a recommendation that dilutes in the time. That is my aspiration. Let's see what we can have.
Thank you all for joining us today. Diego, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing some of your thoughts about these issues.